Hello, and welcome to my tutorial series on how to make a 2D platformer in Unity. In this video, we're going to fix the problem we had earlier of our character kind of doing an eternity jump and making it so that he can only jump when he's touching the ground. Let's get started. So as we covered in previous videos, we have a jumping problem. Our character can jump when we hit the spacebar, but however, as we continue to hit the spacebar, he can jump into eternity. Another problem is that if we hit jump and then we hit the A and D key or the arrow keys that move him from side to side, he just remains in the air. And well, we don't want that. Also, there's no jump animation. So we're going to get started at solving all these problems. And just go out of that, and then we're going to go to scripts and player controller. And the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about two concepts. Right now we have here get key down. And what we're going to put in its place is a term called get button down. And you might be wondering, like, why are there two different ways to do the same thing? And basically it can do the same thing, but it actually is very different. So up here earlier, we replaced putting our A and D key where we had get key down, get key code.d and A, and we replaced it with this horizontal. And the reason we did that was because if we go here to edit project settings and you click on input manager, this was our horizontal command, and that it allowed us to use the A and D key, but also we can use the left arrow and right arrow. If we go down to jump down here, we see that it lets us use the spacebar again, but the thing is that get key down only links your input to the key. When you use get button down, it links it directly to this input manager. So you have a lot more customability with that code. So you can call it anything you like. You can call it jump, you can call it hop. I'm just going to leave it at jump. And also you can change whatever button you want to use without having to recode it again and again. So let's say you don't like the space bar, you can just make it to the Q key. But I'm going to leave it at the space bar. It's whatever. When we do it this way, we have the ability to make it what we want. So let's go back to our code, and we're going to change this up from get key down to get button down. And where it says key code space, we're going to put just the word jump in parentheses. Not parentheses, quotation marks. So just like up here when we use the word horizontal, it has to be written exactly as it is here. So it has to be capital H and then the rest of the word horizontal. This has to be capital J, UMP. But remember, you can change this whatever you want. You can customize this. I'm going to leave it as is. I don't see a reason to change it. So we're going to go here and we're going to hit save. I'm going to go let it load a second. And I'm going to X out this box when that is completed, which it is. And I'm going to hit play. And now nothing has changed. It's still broken in the same manner, but now instead of being linked to just directly to the key, it's linked to the input manager. And just to show you some of what I was talking about, I'm going to bring this back up and go down to project settings, go back to my input manager. And let's say I don't like that spacebar key. I want it to be the letter Q. So then I'll just close it and I'll hit play again. And now I jump with the Q button and the spacebar does nothing. But I'm going to change that back. Where is it? Down here. So I'm going to change this back to the spacebar. And you can make it whatever it is you'd like also. So now let's talk a little bit about layering. So at the beginning of this series, we created, go here, and I'll click tile map, and tile map, remember, was all our ground here. Actually, we're gonna change the name of this so that it's better understandable. We're gonna call this foreground. All right, that's a little better of a name than tile map. So the foreground is all our ground here, all the brown and green we created. And I called it blue background because it's just a background. But if you go over here, and you'll see this word layer appear in the inspector window, and you'll see that it's at default. And if you click the background, it's default also, and so is our player. And that's because they are all in the same layer. And so what you can do in Unity is that you can divide game objects into different layers for different types of functionality. In this case, what I mean is that if we hit play, we can push the spacebar or whatever key is your jump as many times as we want, and it keeps jumping. That's because that's what we told Unity to do. We said whenever you hit the spacebar, you jump. In reality, though, we only want him to jump when he's touching the ground. Just like in real life, you can only jump if you're standing on the ground. So we have to tell Unity what the ground is. So we're going to click on our foreground, and we're going to go over here back to default. I'm sorry, layer, and under default, we're going to hit the tab, and we're going to go over to add layer. So if you see here, there's a bunch of them that are already chosen, that are given numbers, and this is usually the order of the layers. In this case, 0 is the first layer. It's our default layer. I won't go into any of these, but these are the next layers that are used. And so we want to create a new layer that's separating from these, and we're simply going to call it ground. And now we have named our ground and gave it a designation that we can use to tell our character that if you're only on the ground, that's the only time you can jump. So go back here to default, hit it, and now here's our new layer, designating anything that is the ground here in our foreground as ground. So now let's code it into the game. So we're going to go back into our player controller script. And the very first thing we're going to need is we're going to have to call in our collider. Remember, we go back here, let's go to our player. Our player has many components. He has a rigid body, a box collider, and an animator. And if you remember, we did some work with the rigid body, and we had to declare the rigid body, give it a name, and then at the start of the game, when we hit start, we go get that component, and we did the same thing with the animator. And now we're going to do the same thing with the box collider, because we need to tell our script, hey, when you come in contact with the ground, jump, but we have to first tell it about coming into contact, and we can't do that without the collider, which is what the player uses to make contact with things. So we're going to put in private collider 2D, which is the name, which is the type of a component it is. And then we'll just call it COLL for now, just a nice simple name like we've been doing with everything else. So then down here, we're going to go ahead and tell the game at the start, when we hit start, to go get that component. We're going to say, hey, there is this thing called col, for lack of a better way to pronounce it. And we're going to tell you to go get that component. And then spell component right. And we're going to put our greater than or less than signs to tell it what kind of component it's getting. It's getting a collider 2D. And it needs the argument at the end. And then it's going to be a semicolon to close out the line. So the next thing we're going to do is that we are going to go down here to jump. And we want to create two different conditions for jumping. Remember, we have this if statement here. We've talked about if statements before. And so we want to say, right now we're saying if you push the button down. But now we want to tell it to do two things. We want two conditions for our if statement. We want to say if the button is down and you are touching the ground. We need both conditions met. So we're going to put two and signs, and that's just the format for coding, at least coding in C#, is that if you say and in an argument, you have to put it twice. So it's if you're pushing the button down and you and our collider is touching layers, and we'll talk about this in 1 second, and we'll call our layer ground. And we'll put in an extra parentheses, go to the end, and hit semicolon. And now we have these words here, is touching layers, and this is a very specific command in Unity. As I've said before, when we were talking way back at the beginning of this tutorial, we have these using commands up here, these libraries that we're using, system collections. We didn't really talk too much about those. We're not going to do that today, but there's a library of Unity engine commands, and we have to tell the script that we're using that. So if we go here, we go to Google and we put Unity 2D API, what you'll get is you'll get access to the Unity manual. So we haven't talked much about the manual, but there is a manual to Unity that gives you all kinds of information about how it works. It's very well worth going through this. So if we click here on Scripting API for 2D, you'll get a lot of these commands, which are just built-in commands or functions that specifically tell Unity what to do. So if we go down here, we have one called is touching layers. So if we click on it, it's going to say that it's a bool whether this collider is touching any collider on the specified layer mask, which is essentially our layer, or not. So it's basically an all-in-one function that allows us to give commands to the script. So if we go back, and here it is, we created our ground, but we haven't told it what the ground is yet. We have to do that up here. And we're going to go over here and we're going to type the word Serialize Field. Actually, we have to put this in let's go back a bit. All right, we have to put it in those brackets. Can't spell anything today. Serialize Field. And then I'll describe what this is in a second. And we're going to have a serialized field, and it's going to be called private layer mask. We're just telling it that there's a private layer mask, and we're going to call it ground, which is the name we gave down in the function below. If I click on that, see, now we are declaring it. It knows what we're talking about. So back to the serialized field is that we made ourselves a private variable here. We have done this with all our variables. And I believe before we had public variables that we changed. And so what a serialized field does is it makes a private variable, it makes it public. And you might ask, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we just write public? And the reason has to do, and this is a rather extended conversation that we won't have here, but to put it all into a nutshell, basically it has to do with processing. If we were to put public there, it would take a little more to process it. By putting serialized field in private, it makes a more efficient processing. It also has to do other things with, if you're doing larger games with saving and loading, you want to use a serialized field if you want to make your private variables public. I'll have to make a note somewhere or somehow try to fit into the broader scope or a more detailed conversation on that. It's an extensive subject, but we'll have to wait till later to get into it. So we're going to hit save. We'll go back here. And now we did something wrong because we spelled the word collider wrong. And last time I was talking about errors, and I said I didn't do this on purpose, but I said I was probably going to make another error, and I was hoping to have the opportunity to talk about how to troubleshoot errors when you compile code. Some of you have probably encountered this. So you get your big red exclamation point right here, and it's going to tell you that in the player controller script, in row 24, column 29, there is an error. And then it's telling us that this namespace could not be found because obviously it's spelled wrong. It doesn't know what collider is as it's written here. So that's how you read your errors. It tells you your script. It tells you where to find it. In this case, row 24. And it's probably going to say, I'm sorry, I say row, but it's really line 24, and then the column that goes with it. So we'll just spell collider right. We'll hit save. And it will disappear because we resolved our error. So let's go over here to our inspector. Make sure you have player clicked, and under ground, let's just highlight our ground. If you remember, we just spoke about it a second ago. That's this ground right here that we made into the serialized field. That is this ground right here. And actually, I just spotted what would have been another problem. Delete that semicolon right there. That shouldn't be there. And actually, while we're at it, let's actually change this to a capital G and this one to a capital G, because that's how we labeled our layer. So let's hit play for that. I'm sorry, save for that. Go back into Unity. Go back over here, make sure it's labeled as ground. Then we're gonna go up here and hit play. And here's our guy. We're gonna hit jump. And when I hit the space bar, I can only make him jump when he's touching the ground, when he's touching this ground right here. However, we still have issues with our animation, and we will clean all that up in the next video. So, as always, thank you for watching. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and support me on Patreon. All links are in the description below. See you next time.